Good morning again, and we're back in 2 Timothy. We're going to finish chapter 2 today. So, chapter 2, 20 to 26. That's what we'll be reading. Chapter 2, 20 to 26. It doesn't seem like it, but it is a passage that we have to really think about. We have to really pray about, in my opinion. Let's read it. 20 to 26. In a great house there are not only vessels of gold and silver, but also of wood and clay, some for honor and some for dishonor. Therefore, if anyone cleanses himself from the latter, he'll be a vessel for honor, sanctified and useful for the master, prepared for every good work. Flee also youthful lusts, but pursue righteousness, faith, love, peace with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart, but avoid foolish and ignorant disputes, knowing that they will generate strife. And the servant of the Lord must not quarrel, but be gentle to all, able to teach, patient, in humility correcting those who are in opposition, if God perhaps will grant them repentance, so that they may know the truth, and that they may come to their senses and escape the snare of the devil, having been taken captive by him to do his will. So I think you should all know by now that false teachers were a problem in the church of Ephesus. And as Paul writes his letters to Timothy, and by extension all Christians and all churches, there are several exhortations relating directly to false teachers and guarding against false teachers. That was our last sermon, right? Guarding against false teachers. And there's consistent reminder of the things Paul is been telling and has told Timothy. 2 Timothy 2:14, not just to remind Timothy, remind them of these things, the Christians, the believers, right? There is an urging to practice diligence in presenting oneself, or Timothy's self, and by extension ourself, approved before God, handling the word of God rightly and correctly. And that is an incredible way to deal with false teaching, because it is called the sword of the Spirit, and knowing how to wield it allows you to combat anything that counters it. Also, and this is our last point, and we'll elaborate on this a little bit today, because this props up a lot. Avoiding, shunning, learning to avoid and shun properly. That's another tactic we spoke about in relation to guarding against false teachers. Learning to avoid them or shun them properly. And you see this a lot, especially in the pastorals. Avoid, go around, shun. However, as we ended with verse 19 to 20, and this was last time, there was a ray of hope, a declaration that the Lord knows those who are his, right? There will always be false teachers, there will always be false believers. Sometimes we get a little bit too eager to point out people or to single them out as false teachers or false believers. Don't go there. But there will always be false teachers or false believers. But the Lord knows who are his, and he will bring them to himself. He'll maintain their salvation. He'll preserve them. But judgment is coming for those who are false. Nevertheless, and this was the last exhortation we went through, the church is to remain separate, consecrated, and set apart when wickedness is recognized, especially within the congregation. Okay? And these things are the things we ended off with last time. So following that, we get to verse 20. And some translations will have now, some translations will have but. That indicates a shift in illustration. It's not totally disconnected from what's come before. That's why I reiterated it, right? Again, we have false teachers and false believers, and they've got to be dealt with. And this was apparently prevalent in the church of Ephesus. Paul warned Timothy many years ago that this would happen. And here at the end of Paul's life, he has to deal with it again and equip Timothy to deal with it. However, now we're given an illustration. An illustration has to do with a great house and vessels in that great house. All right? So now or but, and here believers are urged to be set apart and to be useful tools and instruments. That's it. Useful tools and instruments in the hand of the master, prepared for every good work. So look at verse 20. In a great house, there are not only vessels of gold and silver, but also of wood and clay, some for honor, some for dishonor. 21, if anyone cleanses himself from the latter, he will be, there it is, a vessel for honor, sanctified, useful for the master, prepared for every good work. Every good work. What are these vessels? What's the word vessel describing? A little bit different in our English translations, but if you look up the Greek, domestic implements, tools, utensils, gear, sails, ropes, jars, pots, and that's mainly what people think of when they think of vessels, but it has a wide range of meanings. So Paul is saying you got a house and you have these vessels, you have tools, you have implements, you have cutlery. Obviously, and you get the illustration, vessels of gold and silver are specifically used for certain things and not used for other things. You know, what do you do with gold and silver? Well, you bring out the best silver for the most important guests. You use it for decoration. Perhaps use it for, a way to scream that you are well off. You know, look at this wonderful piece. You don't use them for ugly or silly things. And without getting too graphic, you don't use them for dirty things, dirty laundry or dirty dishes, right? Or other things, like disposing of waste, all right? You use the other stuff, the vessels of clay, right? The vessels of wood. That's what you use for that stuff. Okay? You don't really display them. You don't give them to important guests. You use them for common or crude reasons. So you got this house, you got two types of vessels Paul is describing. You got the gold, you got the silver, you got the wood, and you got the clay. And the clay and the wood, they're not portrayed here in a particularly positive light, but they're there. And you got to deal with them somehow. And they have their uses, but Paul is urging believers to be vessels of gold and silver. And we have to really think about what that means. Clearly, from the way I've been talking, you can work it out. I believe that the great house that Paul has mentioned is the church. Okay? In a great house, there are many vessels. Vessels being people. The great house is the church. And we say specifically the visible church. You ever heard that term, visible church? It just means the church that we can observe outwardly. I'm looking at you and every other gospel-believing congregation, and I'm looking at the visible church. Why do we call it visible? Because that implies there's an invisible church, because what I can see is not always reality, right? So here you are, you're the professing Christians, you're the visible church, but I don't know your heart. God knows who are really his, as we read before. That's the invisible church. It's not my business, right, to go about and trying to categorize every single person as, well, you're part of the visible or invisible church. That's between God and his people, right? But the great house seems to be the visible church. And the vessels, then, we could say, not merely people, but I would say professing believers. Anyone who says they're a Christian. Right? So clearly in the visible church, the household of God, there's a mixed bag of honorable vessels and dishonorable vessels. Okay? I don't believe this is an end times scenario. I don't believe it's a wheat and tare judgment where, the dishonorable vessels are invisible right up until the end and the Lord will separate the nations. If you take the wheat and tares and the goats and sheep as judgment of the nations, which many of us do, God will separate the nations and, even sneaky false believers, they'll be revealed in the end. That's not the way vessel... I don't think that's what Paul is getting at here. This is an in-house situation in the present that we need to be aware of, okay? And that we need to react to. Also, someone will say, well, hang on, earthen vessels, could that be humble believers, right? The humble. Because in 2 Corinthians 4:7, what does Paul say? We have this treasure in earthen vessels, right? That is a humble declaration of Paul's standing in light of the things God has given him, particularly the gospel. No, because later on, as we'll read, we got to react a certain way to the earthen vessels that has nothing to do with humility. Some will say, well, this is about the variety of gifts. You know, you have these vessels, and why am I kind of hanging around here is because it was a prayerful trial to try to determine exactly how to define what these vessels are. And you'll see why when we get to the first point, we move on from the introduction to the sermon. We're still kind of in the introduction here. We're trying to work out what the illustration's about, right? Well, it's not about a variety of gifts in the church, again, because later on, and even in our verses that we read, verse 21, if anyone cleanses himself from the latter, many, including myself, take that to believe, what's the latter? Well, there are verses of gold, verses of clay, and if anyone cleanses himself from the vessels of clay, he will be a vessel for honor. So again, the vessels of clay seem to be portrayed in a negative light. So it's not talking about a variety of gifts Christians have in the church, all right? This passage encourages some sort of action or counteraction in the present. Similar to the way Paul dealt with the false teachers, as we've been reading through the pastorals, avoid them or excommunicate them and the things we've been reading of, things like that. So the big question is, if the household is the church, the visible church, what are the vessels? What does it mean to be a gold, silver, or a clay and wood vessel? And that's going to be important because that sets up the outline of our sermon. So, I think the vessels of gold and silver, that's fairly straightforward. And I agree with many commentators that these are noble or faithful, that's the better word, believers, right? Hardworking believers. They have the right motive. They want to be used by God in the best way possible. There it is. These are the believers who want to be used by God in the best way possible. Yeah? For His glory and for His sake. So they have the right motive. They have the right goals. They want to be used by God for every good work. That's what it says. You'll be a vessel cleansed, useful to the master for every good work. All right? And they are the household implements that the master is proud to have represent the church, the body, the household. Right? Someone walks into your house and they're a very important guest, or, you know, there's a certain... vibe's the wrong word. There's a certain impression you want to give them. You bring out your best stuff, you clean up your house. I would like to think many of us, when we have guests coming, any guests, we clean up our house because our house reflects who we are. The state of our house reflects who we are. These are the vessels that reflect the best that the church is, or the best of the church. All right. So that's fairly straightforward. And obviously, according to our passage, you want to be a vessel of gold and silver. I certainly hope you do. I'll be urging you to this morning. Every Christian should, at minimum, want to be used by God, right? But let's go beyond that. Every Christian would want to be used by God in the best way possible for the glory of God. Okay? Defining the earthen vessels was a little more difficult. Okay? What are the earthen vessels? Okay? What are the earthen vessels? I mean, Paul uses this imagery a lot. In Romans 9, he did use the imagery of vessels of clay, made for dishonor. He was emphasizing the freedom of God in Romans 9 to do what he will, the freedom of God over humanity, the sovereignty of God over humanity. Here, it's more sanctification within the household. So I'm not prepared to simply say, well, the earthen vessels are vessels of wrath prepared for destruction. Right? They're in the household of God, and they're recognizable, And we know that might be happening in the heavenlies, but this is more something we can observe, we can look at, right? Even though we're looking at the visible church, and we're not in the business of making rash judgments, right? There are still observations we make and actions we take, right? What I would call red flags. To qualify what I said before, to simply come up to someone simply because they've frustrated you and say, you're not a Christian, you're not a part of the visible church. Just be careful. Then to react to someone in a certain way because they're behaving a certain way, while perhaps, talking to them kindly about their profession, or when it's not blatantly obvious that they've apostatized, that's different altogether. Earthen vessels, what are they? Well, some say straight up that they're false teachers. The earthen vessels are false teachers because Paul has been talking about false teachers. He's been talking about Hymenaeus. He's been talking about Philetus. He's continuing the illustration. They're false teachers. I think they could be false teachers, but they're not limited to false teachers, right? I don't think so for two reasons. Because all the illustrations in the pastorals to date, and we just went through a few. What is a Christian? A soldier, a farmer, an athlete. Christian has to understand what their work involves. It involves discipline, focus, hard work. That implies, just giving Christians that command, that implies that there are Christians who are weak or perhaps lazy, right? Not necessarily false believers, but we could say believers with red flags, lethargic, not interested, not desiring to be useful. So that although I'm all for, the earthen vessels are false teachers, I would extend that definition to include believers who have no desire to be soldiers, athletes, or farmers. Now that's controversial because as we get to the verses later on, and I'll discuss this, we're told to cleanse ourselves from these things or these vessels, depending on how you take it. These things could be everything wrong that's been discussed in the passage, or it could be the vessels themselves. I know this is a little bit difficult, but this drove me insane. What are these earthen vessels, and what does that mean? How do we interact with them, and how do we recognize them? And they have to be easily recognizable, right? And how do we do it in a way where we're not sitting there and saying, unbeliever, 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 just because? It's a very sensitive situation, an in-house situation. Right. Secondly, I think the previous verses, when it says, let everyone who names the name of the Lord depart from iniquity, that places the burden of sanctification not just on false teachers, but on all believers. I don't know if you understood that. In the previous verses, when Paul is saying, Timothy, don't worry, the Lord knows who are his, but let everyone who names the name of the Lord depart from iniquity. That means that every believer in the church has let's say this, is required to live in a way where they walk the walk as well as talk the talk. Let everyone who names the name of the Lord depart from iniquity. Now, is that limited to false teachers? Absolutely not. They could cause the most damage, but sin in and of itself in a church is contagious. Remember what we read? It's gangrene, right? It's cancer. So it's already been set up that there are not only false teachers in this church, there are false brethren, and anyone who would adhere to these false teachings or adhere to these false teachers, they're in danger of being that gangrene. Carrying on the disease, so to speak. So I would say earthen vessels can represent false teachers, but can also represent the not so sanctified and therefore not so useful believers. Let me emphasize this. Believers, not just those who are weak and who are struggling and I'm not talking about those who are really wanting to deal with their sin and they're just going through a time in their life where they're down. They're just going through a time in their life where they're broken. We're supposed to come alongside them and try to lift them up. I'm talking about believers consistently who have a consistent life pattern of sin, who have a consistent bad heart attitude, who are behaving in dishonorable ways, who are seeped in sin. They're just perpetually and totally unfaithful, and they have no desire to crawl out of that hole. They don't want to be useful to God. Got to be careful, because it's easy to point fingers at anyone and everyone in the household of God. But let everyone examine themselves. The believers who simply come into the church, tick the box, sit down, and rather than edify the people, bring them down with their consistent, sinful, lethargic attitude and lifestyle. Why do I want to be careful here? And I'm going to say this a few times. And this really caused me to rack my brain. There's a delicate balance. You do not want to look a believer suffering and weak, point the finger at them and say, you're an earthen vessel, got to cleanse myself from you, right? That shouldn't be the first response to a weak believer or a sinning believer. On the other side, and this is where I say there's a balance, you don't want the church to be poisoned by a believer who's flippantly in sin and not interested in revising their attitude, not interested in the glory of God, simply selfishly interested in themselves, expressing all the traits of the false teacher, just coming into the meeting and causing trouble. It's about them. Just unfaithful, and therefore the key word is useful to the master, not useless to God in every sense of the word. You say, oh, well, God could use everybody. Yeah, but we present ourselves to God as instruments of his mercy to be used by him. Yeah, we have a role to play. And yes, God can draw a straight line with a crooked stick, right? But there's got to be desire there to be useful. Obviously, there's action here. Paul says you cleanse yourself from the latter, and we'll talk about what that might mean. You'll be a useful instrument in the hand of the master. These are believers who are happy to remain earthen vessels forever. Again, no desire for progress. And this may indicate a lack of true conversion. But we've got to be careful, because we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. We don't want to look at the weak, the sinful, the broken, the repentant, and include them in the, they say, we don't want to include them in the counteraction that we invoke against the earthen vessels. So yes, they could be false teachers, but I would go beyond that. I would say they could also be worldly believers behaving in a dishonorable way. Now, it is worth noting that there are periods in the life of a strong believer where they end up like this for a season. This is why this is very delicate. Okay? You could have a believer who is faithful, who loves the Lord, and there's a period in their life where something's happened and they're really down and they're really broken and they're lazy, lethargic, maybe not sinful, but they're just hurt. And they can't get out of it. And what do? You come alongside them and you help them. And hey, you know what? This is the meaning of the Christian life. We want to be useful to God. We know the meaning of life. Fear God, keep his commandments. We want to be instruments in his hand. Look what he's done for you. No one's done this for you. We want to love him, come alongside them and try to help them. So there are periods where believers are not always, at peak or desiring to be vessels of honor, gold or silver. And I love a quote from MacArthur from his 2 Timothy commentary, and I quote, he says, all believers should be, but are not always vessels of honor, end quote. So I want to challenge you today to desire, I guess, to be a vessel of gold and silver. I want to encourage you to ask yourself this question: am I desiring to be used by God in this way, in the best way possible? How about this? Am I desiring to be used by God at all? Right? That's dangerous to me. I can understand periods of life when a Christian's weak or broken and come alongside them and you're lethargic and let me help you. But in my experience, usually those Christians, truly Christians, they'll say, you know what, I am in a rut. This is not where I should be. You see, they're not comfortable being there. As opposed to others who are simply comfortable to never be used by God for anything. Coming to church is a transaction, you see. I show up, you look after me, I look after you. I'll give you a little bit of money, I send my kids here, and then I walk out. It's transactional. That's a problem. That's an earthen vessel. And usually such a person's lifestyle is seeped in sin and their heart motivation's not in it. Right? It's not the weak, the broken, and the repentant. And I have to keep emphasizing, you don't want to hurt the sheep when you're trying to invoke conviction in possible wolves. I don't know how else to say it. Do you want to be used by God? Do you want to be this instrument, this tool in his hand? Right? Prepared for every good work. That's what verse 21 says. That should be the meaning of your life. That should be the meaning of your existence. Listen, Christians, we don't have meltdowns, existential crisis, where we wake up one morning and we say, why am I here? Why do we exist? Why is there evil? What do I do? Who am I? Who are any of us? What's going to happen? Nothing's worth it. It's nihilism. Nothing's worth it. Everything is going down, 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 so I'm going to go down with it. No, we wake up and we say, Lord, the whole meaning of my existence is to fear God, keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of mankind, Ecclesiastes 12. How do I serve today? What do I do today? This gives our life meaning up until the very end. Even when we grow old and our body becomes weak and useless and we can't help anyone, we still serve. We still sing. We still have meaning. We still have purpose. That is who we are. Right? That is who our Creator made us to be. So we're never in that situation. Let us then desire to be used by the Master, used by God, and used in the best way. Not just used bare minimum. I want to be these good tools, these good vessels, these good utensils. That's what we should be striving for. So this brings us now to our sermon. That was the introduction. All right? That was the introduction. Some ways to help us be useful tools in the Master's hand. Some ways, only from this passage. We've got 20 to 26. It's the end of chapter 2. We can really make this list up from anywhere in the Bible, right? Anything that, or anywhere that, promotes sanctification. But here we are, so let's talk about this. All right? The first one is by far the most difficult, and that's the one I want to discuss. Even though there's a pattern, and we've discussed this. Let's look at 5 ways that we could be useful tools in the Master's hand. And we'll probably only get through the first one. Look at verse 21. All right? If anyone cleanses himself from the latter, he will be a vessel for honor, sanctified, useful for the Master, prepared for every good work. Let me tell you why this is difficult. Cleanse yourself from the latter, or cleanse yourself from these things in many translations. What's these things? What's these things? Right? Is it all the don't do's? Is it all the don't do's so far? Timothy, do this, but don't do this. Flee this, but pursue this. That's easy. If anyone cleanses himself, all right, so a Christian's supposed to be consistently cleansing himself, sanctified. We're saved not by our works, but we're saved unto them. He will be a vessel for honor. I don't think these things is connected to all the don't do's, right? I think, along with many others, that these things are connected to the previous verse, meaning cleanse ourselves from vessels of dishonor, or at least the very attitude that creates a vessel of dishonor. This is why the King James, or the New King James, translates it, therefore, if anyone cleanses himself from the latter. So there are that's twice now, verses, vessels. Potato. There are vessels of honor, gold, and there are vessels of wood and clay. And if anyone cleanses himself from the latter, which means what? Cleanse yourself from vessels of dishonor, of wood and clay. This is where I got a little bit funny, because it seems to be connected to that. And many men who are better at me than the original language seem to think so. What does it mean, cleanse yourself from vessels of dishonor? If vessels of dishonor, as we've defined it, are those Christians who are perpetually unfaithful and have no desire, seemingly, to be vessels of honor. Cleanse yourself from them. Well, look, we've discussed this so far because this props up a lot in the pastorals. We've discussed ungodly and ungodly friends. We've discussed tactics to avoid false teachers, right? Remember what we said last time? Avoiding people is actually a thing that the Bible tells us to do, right? It's a part of our sanctification. Again, remember, sin spreads like gangrene, right? And there are various ways we can deal with it. And one of those ways is separation. Remember the previous verses, right? All about separation, separating yourself from the wicked things. That's an allusion to Korah's rebellion, as we discussed, right? So here, I believe the concept is reiterated, that believers who are seeking to be used for every good work as vessels of honor are to cleanse themselves or separate themselves from vessels of dishonor. Sinning believers or those content with being useless and unfaithful, especially though false teachers. But remember, we didn't limit the meaning to that. Here's where we have to be absolutely careful, because many Christians, as I noted, will just take a scattergun approach. Do you remember what that means? Just pull out the gun, don't aim, don't be precise, fire at everything and everyone, separate from you, separate from you, separate from you, avoid you, don't read you, don't read you, you offended me, never talking to you again, false Christian. There was that one time where you yelled at my kid, not talking to you, false Christian, separation. There's that one time where you push back against the leader, what he was saying, the teacher. How dare you have an opinion? False teacher, separating from you, right? That happens. It happens a lot. That's not what we ought to be. And that's not how we ought to conduct ourselves in the household of God. We've got to be very careful when doing this. If cleansing ourselves from the latter means separating from this idea of vessels of dishonor or the people themselves, we've got to know how we ought to do it depending on the type of person we are dealing with, depending on the situation we are dealing with. And I will give you some biblical evidence. For example, someone who's in a major sin, it's affected the church, they're not repentant, that's easy, isn't it? Cleansing himself from that dishonorable vessel would mean what? Church discipline, excommunication. Believe it or not, many churches don't do that, but that's fairly straightforward. All right, not always so straightforward. Sometimes you get a repenting believer, they're broken by their sin, but they're having trouble dealing with it. That's not excommunication worthy, right? That's kind of a Galatians 6:1 situation where you come alongside them and, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one with a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you should also be tempted. Right? So, I think it's also easy when it comes to choosing your friends. The Bible does talk about that, or choosing who you hang out with. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. 1 Corinthians 15:33, bad company corrupts good morals. That's in a church, unfortunately, if someone just behaves like a rotten person all the time, or an unsanctified person, you're not going to want to, if you're the type of Christian who wants to move forward in your sanctification, you're not going to be close friends with that person. That doesn't mean you don't love them. There's a way to love someone, right? Love doesn't mean you affirm everything someone is or does. I think we all know that by now. Love is connected to truth, and we love in truth, right? You can still love that person, you can still give up for them, but you're not going to be close to them, ever. Not while they're like that. Right? Do you see how it's different and it's case by case? Separating ourselves from those vessels. It can be hard to accept because there are commands relating to unity, but never uniformity. We're not all to think the same, and unity does not mean that we're unified, as in, we can never, contradict each other, or we can never, discipline each other, or we can never rebuke each other. Unity has more to do with unity in the gospel, unity in purpose, unity for the glory of God, all that kind of thing. Not always bickering over foolish and silly things. So there are, again, nuances and qualifiers, but the church is very clear, though, on purging and cleansing, even when it comes to personal relationships. So again, there are different levels that you can cleanse yourself from earthen vessels. Let's go a bit broader. Local church context. You're looking for a church, right? You suss out what? What do you suss out? You suss out the statement of faith, maybe. You suss out the leaders. You suss out the church itself, just in general. You know, what's this church about? What's its mission statement? How does it view doctrine? And boom, you can make a decision based on what they believe. I'm just going to walk away. This is not for me. Maybe they don't have the gospel right. Could be some lovely people in there. Could be on that broad level where you just, all right, cleanse yourself, walk away. Okay? Where you have identified sin or sinful thinking in a church, you also have the right to cleanse yourself. If a church is so enamored in sin collectively, right? And usually that happens when the leaders are glorified in a way that goes beyond what is written, and they're sinful, and the congregation are sycophants. They're all kind of, nope, this is our guy, we're going to stick by him no matter what. You have every right to walk away and cleanse yourself from those earthen vessels. It works on that broad scale, right? Again, though, on a personal level, right? What a church should be doing is recognizing where the cancer is coming from and purging it. It could sometimes be a person, and we can identify them as an earthen vessel to be avoided or to be cleansed from. Let's look at 1 Corinthians 5, because this was happening, right? 5:9 to 13. Get this, and this is kind of what I'm talking about here when it comes to personal relationships and how to cleanse yourself from those relationships on that level. 1 Corinthians 5:9 to 13, I wrote to you in my epistle not to keep company with sexually immoral people. Yet I certainly did not mean the sexually immoral people of this world, or the covetous or extortioners or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. Let me tell you what he's saying. He's not saying go and hang out with sexually immoral friends. He's saying, when I say not to keep company with such people, I'm not saying in the world, unbelievers, because they're everywhere. You're going to have to go out of the world. You can't simply just say, I'm not going to hang out with this guy because he's sexually immoral. Everyone's sexually immoral. Where are you going to go? Can't go live on your own. That's not biblical. And avoid everyone forever. That's not biblical. You're going to have to interact with people. You're going to have to evangelize to them. You're going to have to interact with them at your workplace. You're going to have to interact with them in other ways when you go out shopping. There is no way to avoid the sin of this world, because then you would have to go out of the world. I'm talking about its presence, not its effect over you. There are ways to avoid its effects over you, but it's just there. It's always going to be there. That's just how it is. In fact, in the next chapter, it says evil men will grow what? Worse and worse. But this is where he hits hard. He goes, I have written to you instead not to keep company with anyone. Look at his language, named a brother. What does that mean? He didn't say, not anyone who's a Christian, anyone who calls themselves or is professing to be a Christian. And this is so abused, but it's so necessary as well. Right? Who is sexually immoral, covetous, or an idolater, or a reviler, or a drunkard, or an extortioner. And look at this, not to even eat with such a person. That was a big deal in the ancient world. To say to someone, I don't want to break bread with you, I don't want to eat with you, that is, I'm cutting off all fellowship with you. How could you do that? You're a Christian. No, the Bible talks about separating yourself. Let everyone who names the name of the Lord depart from wickedness. Is it abused? Yes. Is it not done as it should be? Yes. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. Right? And then he says, for what I have to do with judging those who are outside, do you not judge those who are inside? If those who are outside God judges. Therefore, look at this. Put away from yourselves the evil person. That's an allusion once again to Korah's rebellion. Actually, the law of God in general, not just Korah's rebellion. Put away from yourselves. Put away from yourselves. All those laws that talk about cutting off usually means death in the law of God. Paul is alluding to here. So if you have a situation where there's someone in your life and they could be defined as an earthen vessel, one of these believers so-called, I would say, not just a false teacher, by extension, one who is seeped in drunkenness, extortion, reviling, idolater, covetous. Isn't that a big one? Someone who just always covets, me, more, want, never enough for them. The Bible says, don't even keep company with them. And those are the ones who call themselves a Christian. A perfect example of someone who wants to be a gold or silver vessel, cleansing themselves from the clay and wood vessels. And you're all in the household of God. That's the problem. And it creates tension, but it's got to be done. Let me tell you where the more difficult situation is again. This is about the third or fourth time I say this because I don't want anyone to walk out of this Sunday morning thinking about the Christians in their life who are weak and saying, earthen vessel, bye-bye. Right? There's a more difficult situation where you're dealing with believers who are just content being lazy and useless. And you talk to them and yes, this is sinful. Yes, I just don't have the heart. You're right. And then nothing's done. Right? They're not diligent. They're not even diligent in dealing with their sin. They need you to literally hold their hand with every area of sanctification they're attempting to do. Are they vessels of dishonor worthy of being avoided because of that laziness, that life pattern of sin, or are they just that struggling and weak believer? If you can't tell, right, if the line is that distorted, right, then help them. Err on the safer side. Because again, you don't want to violate Galatians 6:1. If a man is overtaken in a trespass, you're more spiritual, help him out. Because that could be you. That's what Galatians 6:1 says. That could be you. Considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. Right? But what does this involve? It requires wisdom. Right? It requires observation. It requires prayer. It's not easy. But there are cases where it's just clear-cut. Right? There's no conviction over a sinful lifestyle, right? And those cases are clear-cut. In the other cases, I would still say there is a certain way you can cleanse from such people. Hear me out, right? Don't avoid them altogether and don't cut them off. I think a cleansing in that case may involve a limitation of intimate interaction, right? I'm just going to step back a little bit. Because although I want to help this struggling believer, their mentality is contagious. It's toxic. They get depressed. I get depressed. I'm going to pray for them. But do I really want to be close to them and always... I think it's just going to happen naturally. But again, it requires a lot of wisdom. There are believers out there who get angry quickly, but they are believers, and they cause trouble. And the Bible says, don't be friends with the angry man. So some of us have to step back. We love you, we'll help you, we'll make you aware of your sin, but to hang around you a lot, what does the Bible say about attitudes being adopted, mentalities being adopted, lest you be like him? Went through that when we talked about godly and ungodly friends, remember? What I'm trying to say is cleansing ourselves of the vessels of wood and clay is not as simple as or clear-cut as we'd like it to be. And there is also something else. Strong believers tend to resonate towards strong believers. It's just a fact. Right? And often you get the weaker ones left on their own. So then the strong ones have to make an effort to love them. But then you get the clear-cut cases where there's just a lifestyle, hard attitude of covetousness and sin and nope. Don't want this person in my life intimately at all. One would argue, as an earthen vessel, to that degree, he have to be put out of the church. Let me end with this. I used to be very much anti-cliques. You know what a clique is? It's a kind of a US term. Those mean girl cliques. They've got the jocks. They've got the nerds. They've got the the jocks have a certain persona and a clique. The nerds have a clique. The emos, remember the emos? I don't know if there's any emos still around. They have a clique. The gothics, lots of cliques everywhere. It's a small, close-knit group of people, and they don't usually allow you to join them unless you're like them. Yeah? Nerds in the US don't mingle with the jocks, as far as I know, if movies are anything to go by. Right? And you usually got people in their own little cliques. Now, that happens in a church sometimes. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. Saying, George, what do you mean sometimes it's good? How's it ever good? I used to think it's always bad. And I'm against sectarianism. Excessive devotion to a group or person in the church. I'm with George or Tom or John or Marwan, or I'm on the Elias's team, or I don't know, Danny's team, or whoever it may be, right? That could lead to elitism, a group of people who believe they're superior Christians to everyone else in the church. So there's all these things to consider. But one thing I realized, thinking about all these things and thinking we don't want elitism, we don't want cliques, I thought, no, that's going to happen. Why? Because mature Christians with the right desires will tend to resonate and be attracted to like-minded believers. It's going to happen. I can't stop it. And do I want to? After reading passages like this, I've kind of reshaped my thinking and thought, you know what? All right, we don't want the sinful kind of cliques in a church, but whether we like it or not, the mature believers are going to want to hang around the edifying and mature believers. It's just going to happen. So instead of speaking out against cliques, really kind of broad brushing it, how about encourage everyone then to have a desire to be a useful vessel and a mature believer? And then everyone would get along. When I sit down and ponder my own weaknesses, and there are many, right? You pray about it, right? But then what has the Lord designed the church to do? Build each other up. Yeah? And then I consider all the passages about friends and choosing your friends, and when I consider how many weaknesses I have, the kind of Christians I want in my life are the ones who will counter my weaknesses. They'll build me up. Right? Not the ones who would be toxic and promote them, and and they have no desire to edify me in that way, right? Those aren't the people I'm going to resonate towards. Those aren't the people I'm going to be in long conversations with, right? I can love them, right? But they're not the people I'm going to hang out with or want to hang out with. It's just going to happen. Well, isn't that elitism? No, because my attitude is not, I'm superior. My attitude is, I want to be edified. I want to be a gold and silver vessel. So I'll start to resonate towards believers who want to be edified. Not believers who have a sinful life pattern and a terrible, covetous, idolatrous attitude. In fact, to go by what we just read, I'm to cleanse myself from such people. They go into the avoid them category. And I would argue they could sometimes get to a point where they break a church and then the church has to step in and what? Put them out. I have to tell you that. I don't just say no cliques, no cliques, no cliques, no groups anymore. I say no. Let's love each other. Let's be wise. Let's be cautious, right? Not so quick to point the finger, but where it's blatantly obvious that someone is gangrene, whether by false teaching or a sinful life pattern, sinful lifestyle, they're clay and earthen vessels. They have no desire to be useful to the Lord, and they have no desire to be useful for anyone, really. They're just selfish, self-centered, right? Seeped in sin, seeped in the wrong mentality. I have no problem telling all of you, if you want to be useful to the Lord, and you should, cleanse yourself from such vessels. Or even urging the church leadership, if it gets to a point, even if it's not necessarily church discipline, no, this person can't be involved in ministry, can't be involved in the pulpit, because they are earthen vessels. It's a hard one, isn't it? We're in about 50 minutes on the first point, but it really convicted me. I have to give a million qualifiers, because you could do a lot of damage if you don't describe the nuances and the qualifiers, and if you're not careful. The Lord knows who are his, but let those who name the name of the Lord depart from iniquity. I urge you this morning to pray and to strive to be a vessel that wants to be used by God in the best way. If you don't have the desire, what do? Do you melt down and get depressed? You pray. Pray every day. Lord, I'm not feeling this. I want to be useful. I want to be an instrument in your hand. This is the meaning of my life. Understand this. You understand this, it'll change everything. The purpose of your existence is to glorify God as his instrument. Right? And again, part of doing that is you're going to have to cull. Is that the right word? Cull certain people from your life. Cleanse yourself from earthen vessels. But remember who they are. Don't go nuts and get rid of everyone. That's not how we roll. Okay? May the Lord bless his word. Let's pray. Father, thank you. This is difficult. Give us the wisdom, case by case, to do the right thing. Help us to understand what you would have of us. Above all, help us to desire to love you, to be with you, to want to be used by you. Father, we're so content living our life. We get to the end of it, and what have we done? Nothing. There is joy in saying we've been used by you. There is joy in knowing that you have accomplished your purpose providentially through us. Please give us a desire to live for you before anyone and anything else, and everything else will follow, Lord. We love you and we thank you always. Amen.